Okay, let's really unpack this. Think about a physical injury for a second. Maybe something serious like a head injury that meant a trip to the hospital. And I picture that happening years ago. It's done, it's in the past. But what if that specific event, that knock to the head, could actually be independently driving something like a behavioral addiction today? Welcome to the deep dive. We're digging into a really crucial study today that connects traumatic brain injury, TBI, and the risk of developing a moderate to severe problem gambling. And when we say TBI, we're talking pretty broadly here. Any change in brain function from an external hit. It includes concussions if they're serious enough. And maybe surprisingly, TBI isn't exactly rare. Some sources suggest that for adults in Canada, maybe almost 20% have had a TBI in their lifetime.
That's a big number. And then on the other side, you've got problem gambling. Now look, most people gamble, it's fine, a pastime. But for a slice of the population, maybe around 1.9%, it spirals into a problem. And for a smaller group, about 0.6%, it becomes a really severe addiction. And for those folks, well, the consequences can be just devastating, financially, socially, mentally.
Yeah, absolutely. And for a while now, researchers have noticed these two things, TBI and problem gambling, cropping up together, especially in clinics. Like if you surveyed people getting treatment for gambling addiction, you'd find a pretty high number reporting a past head injury.
Exactly. But that observation, while important, had this big question mark hanging over it. Was the TBI itself adding risk for gambling? Or was it just, associated because people with TBIs often have other issues that also link to gambling?
Right, the classic confounding variables problem.
Precisely. That was the key thing missing. We knew, for instance, that TBI often goes hand in hand with higher rates of substance misuse. Things like hazardous drinking, cannabis use, and also serious mental health struggles, like significant psychological distress.
And here's the twist problem. Gambling is also strongly linked, comorbid is the term, right? With those exact same things. People battling gambling addiction often face depression, anxiety, substance issues too. It gets tangled.
It really does. So the core question for this study became super specific. We see the TBI link, fine. But are TBI sufferers maybe just more likely to be distressed or drink heavily? And maybe those things are the real drivers of the gambling problem. Maybe the TBI is just sort of a marker for a lifestyle with multiple risks, not an independent cause itself.
Okay, so the mission for this deep dive is clear. We're looking at this big study that tried to untangle that. Did the TBI problem gambling link hold up after they statistically accounted for hazardous drinking and psychological distress?
That's the crux of it, yeah. Did it survive the statistical cleanup?
All right, let's talk about the data they used. This couldn't be just a small clinical sample. They used data from the CAMH monitor. That's a big telephone survey, cross-sectional, done in Ontario, Canada. They talked to 3,809 adults 18 and over back in 2015, 2016.
And that size and representativeness is key. This isn't just looking at people already in treatment. It's trying to reflect the general population.
Yeah, gives it more weight. And how did they define TBI? It wasn't just any old bump.
No, they were pretty strict, which is good for reliability. To count as having a history of TBI in this study, you had to meet one of two criteria. Either you sustained a head injury at some point that knocked you unconscious for at least 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
Or the injury had to be serious enough to require staying in the hospital for at least one night.
That definitely sets a higher bar. Seems like they're aiming for injuries that were, well, medically significant, traumatic. But quick question on that, relying on someone remembering being knocked out for 5 minutes, maybe years later, how solid is that self-report data? Isn't memory tricky with trauma?
That's a fair and really important point. It is a limitation inherent in this kind of survey design if you're dealing with recall bias. But the thinking behind those criteria, the 5 minutes unconscious or the hospitalization, is that these are generally more severe, more memorable events. They're not asking about a minor concussion you barely noticed. They're trying to capture injuries significant enough that they might have caused lasting changes, making the recall hopefully more reliable than for lesser injuries.
Okay, that makes sense. They're trying to filter for the more impactful events. And what about defining problem gambling?
They used the standard tool there, the PGSI, Problem Gambling Severity Index. If someone scored 3 or higher on that index, they were classified as having moderate to severe problem gambling.
And in this big sample, how many people actually hit that threshold?
It was quite low, actually. Only 1.6% of the total sample.
Wow, 1.6%. So what's that, about 60 people out of nearly 4,000?
Exactly, around 60 individuals. It highlights we're focusing on a specific and thankfully relatively small but clearly vulnerable group, which makes the next part even more interesting.
Okay, let's get to it. The initial comparison. Before they adjusted for anything else, What did the raw numbers show comparing TBI rates between gamblers and non-gamblers?
Well, the difference was pretty stark. It really jumps out. Among the vast majority, the non-problem gamblers, about 14.3% reported a lifetime history of TBI, according to that strict definition.
Okay, 14.3%.
But then you look at the much smaller group, the moderate to severe problem gamblers,
Mhm.
and a whopping 36.2% of them reported a history of TBI.
Whoa, 36.2%. That's more than double. Over a third of the problem gambling group had a significant past head injury.
Is a massive difference, yeah.
But that initial number is really striking. But, okay, remembering the mission, we need to see if that 36% isn't just reflecting people who also happen to drink heavily or have high distress levels.
Exactly. Now we get to the statistical heavy lifting. The researchers built several models, adding controls step by step. The final key model, they call it Model 4, put everything in together. It adjusted for demographics, age, sex, education, and crucially, it also controlled for hazardous drinking and psychological distress simultaneously.
The full cleanup. So after accounting for all those other known risk factors, did the TBI connection just disappear? Or did it hold strong?
It absolutely held strong. This is really the core finding, the aha moment, if you like. Even after controlling for all those potential confounders, having a history of TBI remained independently and significantly linked to problem gambling. The odds ratio, the adjusted odds ratio, was 2.80. So people with that TBI history were 2.80 times more likely to have a moderate to severe gambling problem, even considering everything else.
2.8 times more likely. That's the adjusted odds ratio, the AOR. Can you just clarify for us what that adjustment really means? Because 2.8 sounds huge.
It is huge in statistical terms, especially for social science. What the AOR of 2.8Z tells us is that the TBI carries its own risk, over and above the risk from the other factors they measured. So imagine two people who are identical in terms of age, sex, education, their level of drinking, and their level of psychological distress. Everything else is the same. But one of them has a history of a significant TBI, and the other doesn't. The person with the TBI history is still nearly 3 times as likely, 2.8 times, to develop that moderate to severe gambling problem.
Wow. So the TBI itself is adding a substantial independent layer of risk, regardless of those other issues.
Precisely. It's not just a proxy for distress or drinking. It's contributing its own predictive power.
That statistical control is exactly what was needed. Now, we should also acknowledge the other factors, because TBI wasn't the only thing driving risk here, was it? The study confirmed some other powerful predictors, too.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't acting alone. The study strongly confirmed the known risks. Psychological distress was a massive independent factor. Its AOR was 2.74. So people with higher distress were almost 3 times as likely to have problem gambling, independent of TBI and drinking.
Okay, almost identical strength to TBI.
Very similar, yes.
Yeah.
And hazardous drinking was right up there as well. The AOR was 2.69. Again, nearly 3 times the odds.
So it paints a picture of like a triad of major risks. TBI, psychological distress, hazardous drinking, each one independently roughly tripling the odds.
That's a great way to put it, a triad of independent risks. And importantly, even when you account for the strong effects of distress and drinking, the TBI effect, while maybe slightly lessened from simpler models, remained very strong and statistically significant at 2.80.
Yeah, it slightly reduced the raw association, but confirmed its independent status.
Exactly. It really solidifies the TBI gambling link as something we need to take seriously at a population level. It's not just something seen in clinics anymore. It's a verifiable public health issue.
Okay, so we've established this independent link, but as you said, this was a cross-sectional study, a snapshot in time. So what can it tell us, specifically about cause and effect, the why?
Right, that's the major limitation.
Yeah.
Correlation isn't causation. We see the link is strong and independent, but we don't know the direction. Future research really needs to tease apart 3 main possibilities.
Okay, what are they?
Possibility 1, the most direct. TBI causes problem gambling. The injury itself changes the brain, maybe affects impulse control, emotional regulation, and that change leads to addictive behaviors like gambling.
Makes intuitive sense. What's the second?
The reverse. Problem gambling could lead to TBI.
Oh.
Someone deep in a gambling addiction might be taking more risks in general life, maybe driving recklessly, getting into fights, substance use-related accidents, things that increase their chance of getting a head injury.
Okay. The behavior leads to the injury. And the third?
The third is maybe the most complex. There could be some shared underlying factor, maybe a personality trait or a neurological predisposition that makes someone vulnerable to both getting a TBI and developing problem gambling. Think maybe pre-existing high impulsivity or risk-taking tendencies or maybe even aggression. This underlying trait might lead them to situations where they get injured. And it might also make them susceptible to the allure of high-risk gambling.
That third one is really interesting, especially because, as the source notes, both people with TBI and people with problem gambling often show higher levels of things like aggressiveness, risk-taking, impulsivity compared to the general population.
Exactly. And if you think physiologically, TBI often impacts the prefrontal cortex, that's your brain's CEO, right?
Yeah.
Executive function, impulse control, weighing consequences. If that area is damaged, it could literally impair someone's ability to stop gambling, even when they know it's bad. The TBI might effectively weaken their braking system.
So, whether the TBI directly caused the change in impulsivity or maybe just worsened an existing vulnerability, the end result seems to be this heightened susceptibility to addiction.
That seems to be a likely pathway, yes. The injury interacts with behavior in a dangerous way.
So, regardless of which causal arrow is strongest, TBI causing gambling, gambling causing TBI, or a third factor causing both, the practical implications seem pretty clear. For healthcare, for treatment.
They are massive. This study really gives a strong evidence base for action. For healthcare providers treating patients after a significant head injury, remember, unconscious for 5 months or hospitalized, they really should be proactively discussing gambling risk.
Just like they already warn about drinking or mood changes.
Exactly. Add problem gambling screening to that post-TBI checklist. And the flip side is also true. Clinicians treating people for problem gambling should be routinely screening for a history of TBI.
Why specifically? How does knowing about a past TBI help treatment?
Because if someone has that TBI history, it might signal specific challenges. Maybe increased impulsivity that needs targeted cognitive strategies, maybe greater emotional vulnerability. It could mean their treatment plan needs adjustment to account for those potential neurological effects of the past injury. It complicates recovery.
Right, it adds another layer to understand. So what this study really achieved was taking that TBI gambling connection from just being an observation, something anecdotal, and grounding it in solid population-level data.
Yes, it provides that scientific validation. It shows it's an independent public health concern, not just noise in the data.
It sort of gives the green light for the next stage of research, right? Focusing less on if there's a link and more on how it works.
Precisely. Now, the focus can shift more towards mechanism. Longitudinal studies are needed following people after a TBI happens to see who develops gambling problems and why. That will help sort out the cause and effect piece.
Okay, so a lot learned, but more questions opened up, as always in science. Let's end with a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to chew on. In this specific large Ontario study, factors like age and sex didn't actually show a statistically significant link to problem gambling risk in the final model. Now, that finding about sex is a bit counter to some older research suggesting men are typically at higher risk, although the raw percentages here did lean that way slightly. But given that a physiological event, the TBI, showed such powerful independent predictive strength, does this hint that maybe, going forward, neurological injury or other underlying biological factors might become even more important than traditional demographic factors in predicting who's most vulnerable to behavioral addictions like problem gambling? Something to think about as we learn more about the brain's role in addiction.